I see in your eyes the same fear that would take the heart of me. A day may come when the courage of men fails, when we forsake our friends and break all bonds of fellowship. But it is not this day. An hour of wolves and shattered shields when the age of men comes crashing down. But it is not this day. This day we fight. By all that you hold dear on this good earth, I bid you stand, men of the West!
All right, we're here starting out with the first of the four virtues. I thought we'd start with courage. So my thought on this, if somebody watching this might, or one of our three fans anyway, might ask, why Stoic virtues, right? There's a lot of different systems out there. So first off, I would say what we're building here is a type of, it's an applied ethics. So ethics is a philosophical field of study that says what's right and what's wrong. Pretty important. So we can't just do this willy-nilly. I think it's important to have some kind of framework. And I picked that one, the Stoic virtue ethics, because it's one I'm more familiar with. Yeah, I think you could do this with many different systems. The systems that you see in even Eastern or Buddhist or, any number of different systems. But this is one we're going to work with. I think it's kind of already embedded in a lot of the sort of European tradition anyway. And we're dealing with the West. That's where we're from, so it's just a good starting point. There's a lot of thought out there on the Stoic virtues and how you apply them, and there's a long history of it and all that stuff. But what we're doing is we're taking that and seeing if it has an application, given what we know about the mind and the imagination and the mythic way of approaching the world and all of that kind of stuff. So that's my preamble as far as like why we would want to look at this from that point of view. So if we're going to start with courage as a virtue. So virtue ethics basically state that to determine what is right and wrong, you refer to a set of virtues that are axiomatic within that system. The usual criticism of any kind of virtue ethics is, well, where do the virtues come from? Okay, we're not going to worry about that. We're not going to start with that because that's a rabbit hole. And there's all sorts of ways you can defend it and counter it and all that stuff. And we're just not interested in that because we want to deal with real world stuff. And I think that the essential counter to that criticism is they are self-evident. We know that this is what it should be done. Once we've hashed it out and talked about this for a while, then it is good to be courageous. It is good to seek wisdom and justice. It is good to seek temperance. Right. And like I said, there's other virtue ethics systems out there, but this is the one we're going to work with. And so we're taking these as axiomatic. We're not going to try to defend them. Why you should be courageous instead of cowardly. I mean, it's kind of silly, but that's where we're at. Given all that, then, how would you define courage?
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head of something that has been in the pipeline of conversation, specifically in terms of culture and action and how one should kind of interact with the world. There's always these arguments against why do we do that? Why do we do this? Why is that even a thing? And it's just like, yeah, well, we keep on having the conversations, but so clearly it matters, right? And not only are we having the conversation, but for many out there, they're actually engaging with it on a level in action, in the real world, in reality. What do I think of courage? I really do think it is it's an extension of heart, the idea of heart, and what the heart is, right? That the kind of medieval Renaissance, going back, the Greek idea of this kind of the core of an individual and the expression of it in the face of, well, today we think about it like fear, like action in the face of fear, right? But I think it's more along the lines of, yeah, directly involved with fear, but also the ideas about oneself that are imprinted on them, either those that are learned throughout a lifespan or those that are taught throughout a lifespan, in engaging with one's true creative self. Yeah, I guess that's how I conceptualize courage.
Okay. Well, during the course of these videos, of course, the series that we're working on here is building a kind of positive masculinity. Now, that doesn't mean that these things can't be applied to anybody. They can. But we're going to take the differences that we worked out in the first couple of videos and say, does this give us nuance here to help us focus it on those who are interested in developing that part of themselves further? Yes, the answer is yes. And there are practical ways that you can develop these in yourself in terms of building courage, building one's own courage. It's not something you can just conjure out of thin air. I think that's kind of the fantasy that you might see in popular movies. Like James Bond, he's never ruffled by anything, right? Nothing bothers that guy. He's super courageous. But in the real world, we feel fear, and there's a good reason for it, because if we didn't feel fear, we'd die. But if you're writing pure ego fantasy like 007 stories, you don't have to worry about that. That's a character who is impossible, basically. So in the real world, how do we develop that? How do we become more courageous? How do we work on that? There are a lot of different ways to attack that, but that's one of the things I want to tackle here is exactly how does one do that? Because it's something you see in therapy all the time.
Yeah.
All right. And this is the thing, we get so caught up in these psychological theories and, cognitions and all that kind of stuff that we don't think about what are we really trying to do here in therapy? And it's, if you approach therapy like a purely medical model, then you're going to say, well, there's some kind of lesion in their mind. There's some kind of, behavioral disturbance, and you have to prescribe this series of actions to undo that or fix it or whatever it is, right? That's the medical model. The medical model is not perfect. That's a whole conversation in and of itself. And just suffice it to say that there are other ways to look at it. And those actually jive better with the psychotherapy data that we have. Like I said, that's a huge, like 3-hour conversation right there. We're not going to go down that road. But what we can say, though, is that therapy is a way of developing oneself to better oneself. And that's part of the goal, is to be able to be more in line with the internal dynamics and the external world. Wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so part of what's needed for that are these virtues and developing them. And if you find yourself maybe lacking in some way, if you feel like you need more, right, which who doesn't, then how do you fix it, right? How do you fix it? You're not going to fix it by necessarily writing thought records, okay? This requires a broader view. Now, there's nothing wrong with thought records in principle, but we're looking at the bigger picture here. Courage, I like the way that you describe that as an extension of heart. So it's kind of like a thing to work on the essence of oneself. It's another way to view it. A quality that you have that you are working on building, say. And it's not just never feeling fear, because those people don't exist. Well, maybe a few of them might, but the rest of us mere mortals feel it. But that's not courage, not having it. Courage is feeling the fear and doing what you feel you need to do anyway. That's classic. That's classic. Any of your war vets will tell you something basically like that. And as we go, of course, we're also going to apply this to what we know of gender differences and how those might play out. I think one of the biggest pieces here is recognizing that if men are less prone to feeling fear and anxiety, as the studies suggested, as a course of biology, due to the fact that there's more inter-male conflict and all of that kind of thing, and the reproductive gains that are added to those who have less impulse control, if you will, then this is going to be a slightly different conversation if you are a more testosterone-infused brain rather than not. It does not mean that one is better than the other. It's just different. It's a trade-off, always a trade-off. After all, fear and anxiety are both protective factors. They keep you from getting killed, right? But we're seeking the overall best course of action. Sometimes means overcoming one's own fear to accomplish what you know that you need to do. For example, in a combat situation, you don't want to charge the enemy, but if you may know that cognitively anyway, that's the only way that you and your fellow fighters are going to survive. So you got to figure out some way to overcome the courage, overcome the fear. And if you can do that, then you are labeled courageous. So what are your thoughts on those observations?
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Yeah, no, I think it's specifically in terms of like how men relate to the idea of courage. I think there's that kind of there's a lot of men out there that, because they aren't necessarily engaged with their potential in a way, they outsource their fantasies to these kind of big bombastic grandiose ideas about being courageous in battle and this and that and the other. And I think there has been in the past a lot of manipulation there, specifically in young men, like, hey, look at what you could be in this grand, this battle of things, right? And I think it's symbolic of something much deeper. And I'm not saying this isn't the case for women, but I think for men, going out into the world and testing themselves, right? Testing oneself in the face of adversity, and really, I'm not surprised courage and temperance go hand in hand.
Oh yeah. These all interlock, I think.
Yeah. But I agree. I think the medieval view that came from the Greek view and the Renaissance view that came from the medieval and the Greek and Roman view was that courage was not necessarily just in again, the symbolic and actual form of battle, but it was very much an everyday thing for ordinary individuals. So just as a soldier might say, okay, we have to be courageous here in the fear of this, I think for the majority of people, especially in psychotherapy, it's like, be courageous to soldier on into the world and express that essence, like you said.
Yeah. I'm going to get into some examples from like everyday applications of this for those of us who are not combat soldiers or movie heroes fighting dragons and monsters and aliens and robots and all that stuff. Because you can look at those mythic expressions and take inspiration from them, but it's also possible to look at those and go, well, I'm not Aragorn, all right? Who am I? I'm just some schmuck, I can't do that. And that's so that's not going to be as helpful always. Now, we talked about this in the Beowulf video in terms of how did he do it? How did he handle this? And I thought that in the poem, there was a amazing example of how he builds up his courage, his famous courage. And it's very sophisticated, the way that the poet presents it. It's not, he just goes up there and he doesn't feel fear and he charges in. Not at all. He does not do that. And it would have been so easy for the poet to just say that, right? There's countless of these hagiographies in the medieval, body of literature of how Saint so-and-so just charged up into the town and banished all the demons, and it was just that easy and problem solved, But the Beowulf poet was interested in something much more blood and guts, something more real. Paradoxically, because he's talking about demons and dragons, you know. But the human element is anything, you know, but that. It's very realistic. If there really was such thing as a Grendel's mother that lived in this horrifying mirror, how in the world would you summon the courage to dive in there to fight it? Most people would say, hell no, I'm not going in there. No way. But Beowulf does this, and he doesn't just dive in there, right? As you may remember, when we talked about that, he goes through a process. And I think it's really important to look at this process in fine detail to see how he does it, and because you can apply that in day-to-day life if you're facing something that is terrifying to you. Now, granted, in the everyday Western world, it's not likely to be the demon mother spawned creature, right? It's not likely to be that. But it might be something that you are still, for whatever reason, finding terrifying. Like maybe some people express fear of going back to college. You know, like, oh gosh, what if I fail? Or talking to somebody about something that's emotionally fraught. That's a common one. Simple stuff, right? Asking somebody that you've got a crush on for a date, right? That could be terrifying. So how do you do that? Well, the way the Beowulf does it is that he walks up to that kind of moment of truth, right? And it's a visual depiction of that moment. It can really just be you sitting on your couch contemplating stuff, right? You don't actually have to be at the edge of a cliff. It's a metaphor. But if you find yourself there and you find yourself paralyzed by, I don't know if I can make that phone call. I don't know if I can send that email, right? Or whatever it is. There are some things you can do. You can go, what he does is he recalls the great deeds that he's already done. So this is something then that builds on itself, which we know from therapy. The more courageous things you do, the easier it is for you to look back and say, hey, maybe I am a courageous person. Maybe this isn't so hard. So you're kind of talking yourself into it. But what if you don't have any prior great deeds? Well, you got to start somewhere, right? And then maybe in that instance, you can look back to other people that are close to you that did it. Mm-hmm. Well, they did it. Maybe I can, you know. There's a little bit of that goes a long way. But he doesn't just stop there, right? He also surveys the tools that he has. In his instance, he's talking about a fine coat of mail and a great sword and a helmet and all that stuff, right? And he goes on and on and on about this and how he's got the best stuff that he could possibly get. And he says, okay, he's talking himself into this. I said, well, if I'm going to do this, I better have the best tools available so I know I can be able to give my best. Then he gets out of his head, and this is all in his head, and then he starts talking, and he makes these statements. So he goes from thought to word to deed. The statements are things like, I've done this, I will do this, I will, give it my all. He doesn't make any promises that he can't predict with 100% accuracy. He doesn't know if he's going to win or lose, but he does know that he can and he will charge in there and give it the best that he can. Nobody else is in control of that but him, so he can say that. But it's important to say it. I think that's the important thing, because the word has a creative reality to it. As you probably know from therapy, working with patients, a lot of times it's very important to make sure that the person, if whatever conflict's going on in their head, they need to verbalize it. If they're avoiding something, they need to say that they are avoiding it, because saying it makes it real. And this is the whole reason why people don't want to say stuff a lot of times. All right, we all know this. So just own up to it, all right? We all do this. Well, I don't want to say it because then that makes it real, okay? Well, Beowulf is using that in this instance to make it real. And in other words, he's manifesting the courage that he is needing in the moment, right? Another super important thing that he does in all of the battles is he accepts defeat beforehand. And this is something that's in the warrior codes across the world. If you've already accepted death, then there's nothing to be afraid of because you've already worked through that. Okay. that applies in everyday, less dramatic instances and not life or death circumstances. It's super important because so many people get paralyzed by what if, there's somebody here I really want to ask out on a date. Well, what if they say no? Well, typically what happens after that is you move on with your life, right? You don't burst into flames. You don't crumble into a heap. Nothing bad happened. It's just a word. No. Okay. All right. But if you don't think about that and you don't recognize, they might say no. And okay, then what happens? Then I'll be okay. Well, then there's not so much to fear. But if you don't go through that in your head, then it becomes this nebulous entity of what if this happens? Oh gosh, what if? Right? So you have to, it's a common thing that I teach people to do in therapy. And when I'm teaching residents and students to conduct therapy is basically to teach them how to ask themselves, so what? Well, what if they do that? Well, so what if that happens? Right? If I try to go for the promotion and they say no. Okay, well then, so what? So what if they do? Now, there may be a significant thing to be afraid of in that instance. And that's when, for example, if I go for the promotion, say, and I've only got one shot at this, and it'll make me, for whatever, I'm contriving a scenario here just to prove my point, but like if you ask, then maybe it might mean that you lose some kind of standing in the company for some reason, right? So there's a cost. In other words, what I'm saying is the so what may be, okay, there's the cost. Then it's still not a matter of courage anymore. It's a matter of you deciding whether or not the risk is worth it. Right? What if so here we go. Let's look at this. Say I've got my spouse is getting ready to go on a trip and I'm driving myself crazy with jealousy. What if they cheat on me? Okay. And you have to work through that. Well, what if they do? Okay, well then what am I going to do? Am I going to leave them or not? So we're out of the what if now. We're into what am I going to do about it phase. And there's a whole host of decisions that you have to make at that point. But anyway, so that's all comes from accepting defeat beforehand, accepting the worst possible scenario already beforehand. And that increases the courage, actually, because you've already worked out the what if. Then you dive in, right? Yeah. And recognizing that, well, actually, there's one last stage, and that's consigning the outcome to outside yourself. And Beowulf does this over and over again. And this is something you see in her heroic epics. It's, I'm going to give this my all, but the ultimate outcome is due to the gods or weird or God or whatever. And I have to accept that too. I may not win, but I will have given it my all. Yeah. Right. And so if you look at that in fine-grained detail, what you'll see is that a big part of the fear is accepting control of something that you literally cannot control. And that's what's generating more fear. So this is how you undermine that and keep yourself from doing it. It's a very bad habit, after all. Right? What if the Yellowstone volcano explodes? Right? What do you expect me to do about it? Right? Then I'll blow up. That's what, but there's nothing else you can do with that. Now, before I go on, thoughts so far?
No, there's something you said in there, and I think it warrants a reflection on it. It's the moment of truth, and that coupled with consigning outcome, because I think not only I mean, Beowulf in that situation was essentially encouraging himself, speaking words to it, and he was encouraging himself to enact it, right? Yeah, and I think that's something
himself into it. He doesn't even look back and see if anybody was listening to him.
Right. It was all about just, I can do this to an extent, right? So that self-encouragement, which I think is now very much needed within just modern man in general, just being able to say, you can do this, and encourage strength encourage creativity, encourage engagement with truth, right? The moment of truth. So I think that's really important. Because yeah, you hit the nail on the head, Dr. G, because it really is, you need to do something. And in that moment, whether or not you engage with that, there's a lot of factors there, right? Is this a natural fear to have? Like you were saying, like there are some things that you should be hesitant to do, and that might be just a natural expression of fear. There might be others though, and it's almost like courage versus complex in that moment. It's the difference between, no, this is a natural fear to have, and I really need to consider whether or not I want to do this because it could potentially lead to my demise, and that's it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it that, I'm afraid of somebody cheating on me. I'm afraid to approach this person. I'm afraid to engage with my work environment because I'm afraid that they're going to have a certain outlook about me, or ask for something and self-assert. I think that's really important to kind of take a step back and say, what is it I'm exactly dealing with in this moment? Is this something that I really should be afraid of, or was I taught to be afraid of this? And I think that's an essential part of therapy. It's like, yes, like evaluate where these fears come from, evaluate where this hesitation is, and then hopefully on the therapist side, encouraging and cultivating that deeper part of them that wants expression.
Right. Yeah. That's kind of the core of it. And it's easy to look at this and say, well, you're just giving yourself a pep talk, but there is more to it than just that. Because it also involves a hefty acceptance of things that are outside of your control. And that's really, I think, the magic of it. That's how it works. Because so much of courage gets undermined by this idea that I have to manage the outcome when I simply can't. I can manage my contribution to the effort.
Yep.
And the more you focus on that and forget about the rest, the easier this becomes, and courage then will come to you. And it's not just, you can do it, buddy, win one for the Gipper. It's not that, right? It's not something corny like that, right? Jump, like you said, some things warrant fear, right? Jumping into a flaming bog with monsters in it, that's going to take a lot of courage to do that. But, even in less insane situations, it may require you to build this up and build yourself up to it. So now, how does this relate to the discussion about masculinity? Is that we have to recognize that most men are going to find this a little bit easier in terms of physical confrontations. I think too, though, that this also may apply to non-physical, just because the impulsivity piece is still there regardless. It's kind of across the board. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, it means that you should not expect the same level of set point in everybody out there. There may be some people who are going to find it harder to do this, and that's got to be okay, right? So if you are, say, doing something that, like skydiving, for example, let's just use a crazy example like that. Like you and your partner, you start thinking about going skydiving, and your partner starts freaking out and backing away. It's not cool to, heap guilt and manipulation and stuff like that on them, because you don't know what their inner experience of that is. It may be much harder for them to conjure up the courage to do something like that. Generally, it's going to be the male that's going to be all over that. Of course, not always, but statistically speaking, that's what it's going to more likely balance out at. The flip side of that is, hey, maybe doing random impulsive thing X that your partner is really afraid of doing, it might not be the greatest thing in the world to try, because if your brain is set that way and the kind of male side of things, that means that you're less sensitive to potential injurious danger than she is, right? So value the difference. I guess the point I'm getting at here, the difference is important. It's there for a reason. value it, recognize it, discuss it from that lens. And if you don't have that bedrock that we set in the first two videos, you don't have a real vantage point to make the comparison. You can't look at that and say, well, I'm most likely going to be less sensitive to risk. I'm going to be less risk averse than my partner is. And that's going to be good in some situations, and in others not so much, because there is no absolute correct answer to risk. All the gender difference tells us is that more often than not, it favors you to be less risk averse if you're a male. And that's only with respect to reproductive success and probably not much else. So, all right. But nevertheless, that's what we're brought into the world with. That's what our brains are set to. So that's an important piece of that.
Yeah.
I think one of the ways that I try to train folks to build courage is to imagine a circle around you. And this is something the ancients did. They called it the sphere of choice. And it's really just an imaginary boundary that you contemplate, in which you are actively sorting out what you think is outside the boundary and what is inside the boundary. And the boundary represents what I can change versus what I can't. So like the ultimate outcome of a major undertaking with many complex factors is, for the most part, outside of my control. And the argument goes that if it is out of your control, there's really no reason for you to waste any energy on it. Rather, the only thing you should be doing is accepting whatever the outcome is going to be. And that takes practice. So it's something you need to work on daily to be able to do that. I'm not presenting that as something that's easy, because it is not, especially if you are more of a control freak, right? Anyone who goes through many, many years of college, you might be a control freak to a degree. Just saying. Right? We self-select, those of us that go through that much education. So it's going to be a fierce issue to deal with. What if I don't pass this big, scary exam? Right? I've faced that many times. The step 3 board exam is 2 days, 8 hours each day of grueling questions over and over and over for hours and hours. It's brutal. And if you don't get it, you don't get your license. Scary.
Yeah.
How in the heck do you manage that? Well, again, you separate it out. Have I studied? Yes, to a reasonable degree. And that I have to figure out what that means, of course, to given my own value system. Does that mean 24 hours a day? Or do I study at the expense of my children or my family? No, I'm not willing to do that. But I'm going to study very hard. And then you go in, you take the test. Well, what if I don't pass? You can't be thinking about that.
Yeah.
You got to think about, what's the next question in front of me? Am I giving this my all to the best of my ability? And then I have to let go of the outcome and let it come, whatever it is. All right. So that's one example from life that doesn't involve dragons or monsters or, international spies.
Yeah. No, it's a good example. It's a good example. I think like also a slight reframe would be to also consider the journey towards an end is more fulfilling than the end in and of itself,
Yes, absolutely.
I know we've talked about this a lot, but I had a conversation with a buddy of mine recently, and he's here in the US, but discussing really just the courage to be creative and how he handles certain patients that really do have this creative impulse. And surprisingly, a lot of men who have this creative impulse, but they almost have this perfectionism. It's just like, I can't even speak it out into the world because I'm afraid it might come back a certain way or it's going to be denied. And I'm like, I see, yeah, man, I see it. I see it so much. I see it so much in people that just generally have this idea and this block against, oh, that's dumb. Why should I do this? Why should I do that? It's just going to fail. just like,
Yeah.
well, the point isn't necessarily for the acclaim, right? Whatever it is that, culture is telling you that this is, in order for you to be creative, you need to be creative and everybody has to love it type thing, right?
Right.
It's like, no. The creative process is very much a part of just expressing yourself. And that in and of itself is what's calling you to complete it. Yeah, I think.
Perfection is the enemy of good.
Yeah.
And that perfectionism is something that is so good at generating anxiety and fear.
Mm-hmm.
So a big chunk of work must go into recognizing if you have a perfectionistic streak. Again, those of us that have gone into the medical profession or advanced degrees, we're going to have some perfectionism. It's just part of our nature, right? You self-select. Again, it's a group of people that are just going to be higher on that scale. Because if you weren't, you wouldn't bother with it. Because you'd be like, man, that's too much like work, which it is. It's a lot of work. So only people that are a little bit nuts like me would do that kind of thing. So as long as you get okay with that, all right, in other words, accepting those factors within yourself, and we haven't gotten to that yet, but that's another piece to this. Then you can look at it and go, okay, but is this serving me right now? And is there a way I can craft this so that it does? If I have a desire for perfection, first one, I have to realize I'm not going to achieve it. But that doesn't mean that I have to pretend like it doesn't exist. I just have to modulate it. I have to say that there is a drive for excellence there. That's the kernel of the good in this. As long as I get rid of the idea of perfection and I pursue this to the best of my ability, then I can carry forward and not get caught up in, is it perfect or not? Because that's going to squelch creativity, progress, whatever it is your goals are. Going to tear it up because you're going to be, like you say, you get paralyzed by that. Some I've seen over and over again, therapy. Paralyzed by perfectionism.
Yeah.
If it's not perfect, I just can't deal with it not being perfect. So I don't do it. And then that generates more like shame, self-loathing, all that kind of stuff. Why can't I get anything done?
Yeah.
So forth and so on. So what I try to do is, when I'm faced with a lot of stress, a lot going on at work, say, a lot going on in relationship issues, maybe, who knows what, family, all the day-to-day stuff. You picture the circle around you and you say, back to virtue. Okay, just remember that phrase because the ultimate guide here is what should I be doing? And classically in Stoic philosophy, it's pursuing virtue is what you should be doing. And that's really the best and most useful thing for you to do with your time. Now, the only way to do that is to first recognize what is within my control to change. Okay, because everything outside of that is not my responsibility. It's my responsibility to change what I can change. I mean, it's just pure logic. Nevertheless, once I do that, okay, so then within my sphere, my little corner of the universe, can I improve it by working on justice, temperance, courage, wisdom within that circle, back to virtue? That's what I work on. And I've gotten to the point where I use that kind of as a mantra. Like if I'm really worked up, or okay, back to virtue, right? Just work on what is here, what is within my sphere. And it helps to undermine that overwhelming sense of, oh my God, I just can't deal with all this. It's very helpful. But you have to do the work to get to that point by knowing what the sphere means and all of its nuances, right? Because it's not simple, really. There are many times when you're not sure exactly if I can control A, B, or C. And a lot of it has to do with other people. So yes, ultimately what person X does is out of my control, but I can influence them to a degree. So that's where I have to, fine tune the boundary. I think the important thing is to recognize that there is a boundary. That's the most important aspect of this. And then work on defining it as best you can. And then at that point, once you've done that, it's relatively straightforward to say, okay, back to virtue. Let's work on what I can do. And how can I improve my little sphere? my little
Yeah.
bonnet. So now here's another aspect of courage. I wanted to get to this. Courage also involves reinforcing your own boundaries, personal boundaries, right? In relationships. So this is where the gender thing comes in, and just sort of general relations with other people. Would agree or disagree, you think? Is that an element of courage, would you say?
Well, it has to be, yeah. Yeah.
Because it's so difficult and because it involves courage,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's inescapable to be thinking along these lines. And a lot of times I've had patients that their boundaries were poor in the sense that they would overextend themselves. Frequently women would do this. Because they're afraid, well, what if A, B, or C doesn't like me? What if they think mean things about me? If they think I'm mean or bad? Of course, the answer to that is, well, so what if they do? Right? But of course, that's going to be easier for some people than others. But it's all based on an assessment of self-worth. So now, one thing we haven't talked much about is the fact that courage in many, many cultures, a woman showing lack of courage is okay, but a man showing lack of courage, not okay. In other words, that's much more heaps of cultural shame gets piled on a man for that. That can encourage men to hide their anxiety and fear because they want to avoid the shame. But it doesn't make it go away, of course. It's still there. So that's something to consider too in the gendered version of this conversation. I just wanted to throw that out there before I carried on, though, because I think it's connected to the boundary idea.
Yeah.
Where I'm trying to assess whether or not A, B, or C can be asked of me fairly, and if it's fair for me to say yes or no to it. Okay, but then even in that situation, the answer is the same. Back to virtue. Is this just? Because I want to work on justice for others, but I darn well better work on it for myself too. Because not working on oneself doesn't make any sense. I don't know why this is so difficult, but there's a tendency in everyone, including myself, to think that being fair to everyone else is here, and being fair to me and not asking too much of myself is way over here and has nothing to do with this. How does that work? It doesn't. That's crapola. And yet we do it all the time. I know you've seen this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thoughts on that, on boundaries? What do you think?
Well, boundary, as you were speaking, something came to mind. David Hume's quote, "A wise man's kingdom is his own chest." And then he goes on to say that a man should only be concerned with the voices, critical voices of only a select few, right, around him that he trusts.
Yeah.
And I really like that because I think it speaks volumes about, again, control, but also
what do you think of social media?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I don't agree with everything he says, but I think for the most part, he was hitting a nodal point, which Jung talks about a lot too, is that, you do have all these cultural ideas about control and what others should do. And to a degree, I think it's an important conversation to have. But then if you're not internalizing that yourself and you're asking, how am I contributing to not only my life, but the lives of others? Really, what are you doing, right? Are you the king in your own castle, so to speak? Are you the one that kind of understanding that your kingdom is here?
Yeah.
I do think that's really important. I think you made a really important observation. Yeah.
So yeah, and that's something that I've seen many times too, is as you notice, the idea of courage naturally dovetails into the conversation about feelings of self-worth. I think it's interesting. I think there's more work that can be done on that, but it is an observation that I've noticed, and why that is and warrants further investigation. But the point is, when I start thinking along those lines, it's very easy for people to say, well, I don't feel good about myself because so and so said I was X. Now, in therapy, my response to that is, okay, but what do you think? Were they right or wrong? And this is where the courage comes in. I have to be the one to take the courageous step forward and say, this is what I think is worthy and this is what is not. And I can't just sit back and say, well, somebody else said I'm no good, therefore I'm going to feel no good. That doesn't fly.
Right.
And kind of speaks to the quote you made by Hume. You know, it's the same idea with the reason I brought up social media is because people get on there and they worry endlessly about what random people they don't even know are saying about them, or they'll try to have a conversation and they'll wind up with pure noise and nonsense and stupidity.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I mean that kind of leads to my own first rule of social media is cast not pearls before swine. Right? Don't waste your time. Don't waste your time with that stuff. Select few, right? Keep it to the select few. Those people whose opinions you value.
Yeah.
And then you decide, of course, that's within your sphere, to let that in or not. And that applies to past assessments of your worth as well. Even people super important, right? You know, parents are imperfect. Sometimes they're awful people, but most of the time they're just imperfect human beings. And they may say something that stuck with you, and you have to ask yourself, is that true? Do I have to internalize that or not? Because many times you do not. And that's okay. It doesn't mean you have to hate them or be resentful and go down all that stuff, right? That's temperance, but that's another conversation. But at the end of the day, though, you're the one that's in charge of what gets in and what doesn't.
Yeah.
And recognizing that sometimes that conversation is tougher than others.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of leads into the idea of living within your nature, in accordance with your nature, I should say. I think sometimes budding Stoics will think that they can just sort of wall off the world and pretend like they, you know, can just conjure up whatever they want within the sphere, right? That's not how it works. Because we're social creatures, we're social animals, we live within a culture. And that's okay. So if I'm feeling guilt, for example, I can look at that and say, well, I shouldn't feel guilt because it's something from outside. That's too easy.
Right.
Maybe I need to feel guilty. What if I did something that's not okay? Right. And in that case, you're living in accordance with your nature, because feeling guilt is a natural emotion. It comes from being a social animal. That's why we feel it. Although certain celebrities don't seem to have any sorts of guilt or shame at all, but that's another conversation. Yeah. So the reinforcing of one's own boundaries is a reflection of courage, I think, based on a rational assessment of your worth as a person. And if you're not living up to whatever it is that you think you should be, you have to recognize that the only person in charge of that is you. So why are you not? Is this an element that you've been neglecting, holding you back? You know, or not. I think they're related. It's related to self-esteem. This whole conversation is related to self-esteem, and that's an aspect of ego strength. And Stoicism is very good at building up ego strength.
Yeah.
And this is one of the reasons why. It's because it forces you to focus on only those things that you can actually change, and says you get laser focused on that, and it helps to build that. And this development of courage is one of the ways in which that happens. But I wanted your thoughts, like, how do you feel like this connects to the concept of ego strength?
Well, ego strength, but also how it connects to modern man, you know, and the generation millennials, and then the generation coming up, and how that is very. Do we encourage courage? Do we encourage action? Right, but not necessarily rash, destructive action, or so on and so forth. Are we overly engaging with safety for the sake of protection and so on. I think there's a lot of ideas around courage, action, and that leading to a more open individual. Funny enough, I think people that are the most kind of confident in their action, confident in their lives, are also the most accepting. And I think you see now more than ever that there are a lot, I think collectively there is this almost kind of, there are a lot of ideas about safety. There's a lot of ideas about action that aren't necessarily the most generative and productive, but also that leads to a more porous ego, in the sense that if I'm consistently not going out and testing myself in action, then there's something missing within myself. And whenever I'm confronted with something else that might be contrary to it, or I might take offense to it, I'm just a powder keg ready to explode with all these like emotions and I mean very complex driven actions. I think being courageous.
Oh, I was going to say that you're seeing the connection between courage and temperance.
Yeah.
There, in the sense that if I don't develop one, then the other is out of balance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And by the flip side of that, as I develop one, the other one becomes stronger as well. So it becomes easier to be temperate if I'm courageous.
Mm-hmm.
And if I don't have courage, if I'm lacking in that, then temperance is much more difficult, because everything feels like it's life or death.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't accept other people's opinions that differ from mine. And I have to blow up at them, or I have to wall them off, or I have to freak out, or I have to, join a cult or whatever it is. And all that's crazy stuff, just crazy stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, being able to say, I'm okay with there being something other than the ideas I have, right? Means that you probably tested a lot of your life and said, oh, where's my character, right? Who am I really? And if you don't test that courageously.
Another dimension of courage here that we haven't talked about yet is the relationship between it and humility. And that I think some of the most unhumble people out there are riddled with fear. And that's why they present like that. I mean, classic narcissistic defense. I'm the greatest, period. And as a reaction to feeling inadequate, I'm going to present myself as better than everybody else.
Yeah.
Right. And it's because of a lack of courage that they're doing that. Paradoxically, the more courageous you become, the more humble you become, because you have to accept that which is outside of you. Yeah. You have to accept imperfection. You have to accept all this stuff that a less practiced person will have a whole lot harder time accepting. Oh, I'm not going to accept that. Okay, why not? Well, that just, well, what if, right? What if I'm wrong about that? Well, I can't be wrong. Well, guess what? You're likely wrong. I remember I was talking to Robert Stickgold, of all people. He's a researcher in the dream science. A lot of really interesting papers. I got a chance to talk to him once. And somebody was arguing with him about his theory, and he said, I think you're wrong. And Robert just said, well, there's no doubt I'm wrong. It's the question is, how am I wrong?
I love that.
And I love that. It stuck with me, because it's like, yeah, I've accepted the fact that I very likely am wrong. That's not the point, is it? No, because as soon as you think about it, if you sit back and go, well, what am I working on here? Am I working on being always right? Because good luck with that. No, that's not the point. What is the outcome? The outcome is the journey. The obstacle is the way. Right? All of that great stuff is bound up in this idea of, because I've accepted imperfection and possible defeat, while at the same time knowing that I'm going to give it 100% of what I have, then there's no reason for me to be ego inflated or ego deflated, because that's all anyone can reasonably ask of me.
Yeah.
And so that's the trick that does this. That's why I'm joking. It's not really a trick. It's the technique.
Yeah.
Internalizing that thought process, letting it soak into your bones, and it becomes easier. It doesn't become easy. It becomes easier.
Yeah.
Because a big part of this is we're dealing with primordial affects, stuff that is so ancient that our frontal cortex is only going to be able to overcome that to some degree, right? No matter how good of a practitioner you are, or a Zen master you are, there's some things that your body's going to be like, nope.
Yeah.
Nope. And you have to be okay with that, right? That's another piece of this. Well, my nature is to that of a human being, of a man, of an organism,
Yeah.
and that's what I can accomplish is what I can accomplish. As long as you know that you're not just convincing yourself that you've given it your all, because I've seen people do that. Well, I tried. Did you? All right, make sure you're not BSing yourself on that question.
Yeah.
That's where the wisdom comes in.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. The caterpillar does not decide to metamorphose into a butterfly.
No.
But human beings, we can think all day about the what ifs, right? And try to convince ourselves that we don't have to take that next step. And it's yeah, man, I completely agree. I think really just understanding that essence and being able to express it. And especially for men now, younger guys, listen, talk to that girl, talk to that girl, develop
Or
yourself.
guy.
Yeah, or guy, yeah, whoever it is, talk,
Whoever
yeah,
it is.
have that hard conversation, or the one that you at least conceive to be hard, because inevitably I think it's going to be more fulfilling if you actually do than you think about doing. Yeah. It's a process, like you said, though. It is a developmental process getting to that point. I think the best that, especially men who have been through it, the best thing that they can do is encourage in others that haven't. And I think that's a part of male initiation through and through, is that really encouraging that spirit of again, I think it's a spirit of creativity. Create yourself. And men that have been through it have to encourage it in others.
Right.
And not try to snuff it out and say, no, you know what, you stay there, look at me. Right. I think you bring up a good point about that. There are a lot of guys out there that are going to be more than willing to puff up their chest, but really in reality, they're afraid.
Yeah.
They're afraid.
They're afraid. They're afraid of not being the top of the heap.
Mm-hmm.
They think that being the best and the most admired and all that means something. Which virtue is that?
Yeah.
None of them. The virtue of ego inflation, right? That's not in sorry, not in there. And because okay, well, so what though? So what if you are? Then what? Nothing. It's worthless. But we're working on that. It's very important to try to stay focused on that. And when you're facing something that is scary and you've looked at the consequences of, well, what if I don't? Or what if I try and I fail? And if the answer is nothing big happens, well, then that you've gone a long way towards working on the courage to do it. On the other hand, if the consequences of a realistic failure is too much for you to accept, then that's okay too, because you're looking at it's still not an issue of courage anymore at this point. It's an issue of risk management, of cost benefit ratios, of is it worth the possibility of A by doing this? As long as you work through that, then you've moved past the paralysis of fear and into I'm taking control and managing the risk in my life in one way or the other, whatever it might be. And it's not a matter of courage anymore. But you got to go through that process to get to that point.
Or it might be courageous to say no.
Yeah,
that I'm not going to, like I know plenty of people. I can only speak for myself in this regard, but having had back surgeries and other guys, there's a group of guys that I'm connected with online that are pretty much trying to get active, but having had orthopedic surgery and so on and so forth, they have a history of issues. And it's like one guy was like, yeah, I'm going to go do this tackle football game without any pads. And, I really don't want to do it, but I feel like I have to sack up and do this and that and the other. I'm like, man, it might be more courageous for you to say no to doing that and know that you could potentially really, really hurt yourself.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily have to do it. And I don't think he had heard that before. It was like, oh, actually, yeah, maybe you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because again, those cultural norms, whether you agree with them or not, they're there. The idea of you need to man up, you need to sack up, you need to, summon the intertesticular fortitude, or whatever the phrase is. Those are there, and it will take courage sometimes to buck those. And only you can say at the end of the day whether or not it's worth it to you to do that or not, or to say no, because that's taking on a risk in and of itself of being, teased or shamed or whatever.
Yeah.
But then again, is that value system yours? If it comes from outside, you have the choice to accept it or not. And I don't mean to say don't accept any value system outside of yourself. I'm not saying that, because that's not necessarily the answer.
Yeah.
It's evaluate it, assess it, see if it works and makes sense to you. And if it does, live by it. You were mentioning the mentoring and the rites of passage and all that kind of thing. That's an important piece of this too. Action in physical space, right? Doing stuff. Beowulf understood this, which is why he would go through his heroic deeds that he'd already done. And this is also, I think, a big part of initiation rituals too. You got to do it. But then from that point on, for the rest of your life, you can look back and I did that difficult thing. And it can be a source of courage for you.
Yeah.
It's not just a solely intercerebral exercise. That's, I guess, the lesson I'm trying to convey here, is that you can't just conjure this up out of midair. Sometimes it takes action, physical action, and proving to yourself that you can. And connecting with others that you trust, who are giving you advice and saying, yes, this is the way, right? Like the Mandalorian, this is the way.
This is the way.
All that stuff, right? Yeah. So that's why in a culture that doesn't encourage or foster or nurture that kind of stuff, we are likely to see more difficulty with courage in the younger generations. Yeah. And it's an intergenerational problem. This thing's been going on for a while. It's a big problem. And so we're asking everyone to do all the work themselves. And that's not quite cool. But then that's why you and me are here, right? We're trying to we're working on our sphere.
Yeah, exactly. Guys, if you're out there, we encourage you. Everybody, you can live a fulfilling life, hands down, through and through. You can live a fulfilling life. You just have to engage with that essential spirit.
All right. Well, then next time, let's work on temperance.
Love it.
All right.
Love it. All right, Dr. G. See you guys.
Bye-bye.